Hello and welcome. This is Dan Corcoran. Welcome to my channel, or shall I say your channel, because today we have a returning guest, Leigh Ann Yates, who assembled a panel to share how to do investigations in a healthcare setting better. Look for some really good takeaway knowledge in this exciting episode. First, let me say our sponsor, SafeQual, has all sorts of software to help you pursue excellence. They really know what they're doing and have reinvented what software should do to make you and your healthcare system more productive at improvement, risk management, safety, quality, and compliance. They also believe in supporting this channel, so go visit them at www.safequal.net.
Thank you guys for joining us today. We have here Cody Robison, who is president of Texas-based Investigative Specialist, which provides insurance defense through social media analysis and surveillance and SIU services. In addition, we have Melanie Taylor, who is a partner in Atlanta with Bendin, Sumrall, and Ladner, and specializes in medical malpractice. Today, we would like to gather together to talk about an important topic to risk managers and those in the healthcare field, and that's interviewing investigations. Most risk managers do not receive formalized training on how to interview somebody, how to formulate an investigative question. And so we thought today would be really beneficial for risk managers to be able to hear from the experts in the field on the best practices, what has worked for you in your interviewing investigative techniques. So we have three scenarios that I want to kind of go through, and they involve, one involves the risk manager, the other physicians, and the other one like HR folks and several disabled employees. So as we move through those, we'll be asking questions to get, your take from your lens. What do you think best practices, how you would handle something, how you would recommend, sentence structure or investigative questions. So the first risk management scenario comes to mind. Risk managers have, untoward events that happen all the time. When there's a medication error that has happened that has led to patient harm, usually what we do is called a root cause analysis, which is an investigative process to figure out what is the root of the event and what caused the harm. So to do this, they have to go out to the floor. They have to interview nurses, physicians, whoever was involved in the particular event. So think about that scenario and, what are some basic questions that you feel risk managers should formulate to get a snapshot of the scenario? Now, keep in mind, when things like this happen from cradle to grave, it might just be an incident. It could develop into a claim, or it could develop into, a lawsuit where we hire an investigator to go out, or, we might hire an attorney to handle the defense. So with that in mind, what are some basic questions that you would recommend for the risk manager to take back? And how would you structure that, trying to get information out of the folks that were involved in the events? And that's a little tricky too, because people feel nervous if they've made a mistake or they think they're going to get in trouble. And oftentimes they want you to ensure them that they're not going to get written up, they're not going to get fired, and that sort of thing. So Cody, let's start with you.
Sure. So I would start out by saying that, again, that, there's unfortunately not an exact method of questioning you'd want to ask. That's going to kind of vary from scenario to scenario. What I would say is, it's if you can find out as many answers as possible before you start interviewing folks, it gives you that benefit of kind of knowing some of those answers before you begin. That way you can see if maybe there's any misrepresentation in the answer. So, looking at schedules, who was working that day, who wasn't, what are the relationships between the people between those employees? Is there any video that, may show anything of the incident that occurred? And then asking your who, what, when, why, hows, who ordered, who provided the meds, who ordered that the meds be given? Has this type of incident occurred before? The individuals who were working this time, have they been involved in any incidents? So, you want to have some questions written out as you sit down with these individuals and start doing your interviews. But you don't necessarily want to just be focused on only the questions that you have. You may get a response or reaction that, leads you down another line of questioning based on those answers. So you really kind of have to just have an idea in mind of what you're going to ask, but be flexible to vary from that as needed. You're going to have some situations where you're able to build a good rapport with that individual, and there may be good relationship already in place with the individual you're interviewing. And so that may change the flow of the conversation where, maybe you want to have another person sitting in on that interview or another person conducting that interview. You may not have a good rapport with that individual. It may affect how they answer or how they, their defensiveness. There could be situations where you want to use some open-ended questions to let them just talk and let you listen and maybe take some notes. There may be situations where you want to use a closed-ended question to redirect them, to get them back on track if they start to go down a path that you think may not be beneficial. So there's a lot of different ways that you can tackle it, and there's going to be a lot of questions you want to ask. But I would say you really want to do your homework up front before you start interviewing folks. In the order in which you interview individuals may also be important as well. If there's an individual who you think may have been the one who was, the cause of incident, you may want to interview them last after you've interviewed everyone else and have an idea in mind of some of the responses. You may want to interview them first and then interview them again last to see if their responses have changed. Check the consistency in those responses.
Good point.
I was just going to add, I think the thing that's unique about this scenario, Leigh Ann, is that presumably if it's a error in medication administration, nobody knew it at the time, right? Because they wouldn't have intentionally given them the wrong medication. Right. So I think from a lawyer's perspective, there are three things that I usually ask when I'm talking to a witness. And I let them know that they can, if they have specific recollection about what happened, then I want to hear that. They might have no idea. So then in that case, I want to know what their custom and habits are. What do they usually do when they're, filling this kind of prescription or treating this kind of patient? And the third scenario is, I have no idea what I did. This is my custom, but looking at the record, based on the record, this is what I think happened. And so it's kind of a more informed response. But in any case, I think it's key to let them know. I mean, obviously they didn't know that the error was happening at the time. So, making sure that when you get the information, as the interviewer, how they're coming up with those responses. Is it because they specifically remember? Is it because of something in the record? Or is it just based on their customs and habits?
Good points. I know when I've been in the room and interviewing folks too, it's important, I think, to, when you phrase the questions, tell me more about whatever happened versus who did it, who is in the room, or yes or no questions, because people, they won't give you any more information. They'll just, stop right there. So those, I think, are really good points that both of you brought up. And, the legal ramifications, I think, if they're hiding something, or it could be a criminal, intentional situation as well. Those things we have to consider too when we are, thinking about the line of questioning and try to plan out. Sometimes you don't have enough time to plan. Something happens and you get an emergency call to go to the floor, to the OR or whatever. And you just have to, at least, go over the information quickly in your head to figure out what the game plan is going to be. For instance, our next scenario number 2, and this has happened multiple times. I'm sure for many risk managers, physician comes in, they are on the schedule to do a surgery, they smell like alcohol, and everyone's afraid to say something. He goes ahead with the procedure, harm occurs to the patient, And then there you have it. And then, things start to unravel from that vantage point. So are there any particular sentence structure questions or investigative questions that you would recommend in that scenario when you have something that potentially, maybe it might be criminal, maybe not, maybe it's just the person's addicted, they might be an alcoholic, or they might be under a lot of stress, how would you recommend handling the investigation or interview questions in that scenario? Cody.
I think, the first thing I would say is you probably in that situation want to get with HR legal, maybe get those folks involved as well, because that, sounds like it could be an incident that, could blow up into a bigger issue. So, I think that's where I would start on that. Then again, you may want to look at those relationships. What relationships are in place with that physician and those people in that role, because that could dictate which way you want to go also. You want to ask all those who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. But, is this a situation that's occurred before? Has this occurred with this physician before? Who was the one who reported it? How often has it been reported? The individual who believes that he is intoxicated, what training do they have in identifying intoxication? Is there a chance maybe he's not intoxicated, that he's actually on some sort of medication, whereas he still shouldn't be, doing the things he's doing, but it's not, intoxication, it's some other issue. So you before you even get to that, I think there's a lot of questions you have to really look for answers on. And then in the situation, there's, it could be criminal. I mean, depending upon the outcome, then, you may want to go down a different path of questioning of how you downplay the importance of the and trying to get the information you need. So some individuals are going to respond differently in some situations than others, as we all know. And, and kind of going back earlier too, asking as you go through and you're interviewing and you're asking these questions, the answers you receive is only half the equation. It's you have to be able to interpret these reactions and responses to see if there's any misrepresentation there. If you're getting answers and you're just going off of face value and you're not looking, looking to see if their nonverbals and their verbals align, and looking at tone and why did they respond this way at this time, and looking at the totality of circumstances, that could change how you may pursue or how you move forward in the line of questioning you go forward with from there.
And I think it depends also, right, on who you're interviewing. So if like in the scenario you gave us, Leigh Ann, there were people who suspected it, but they didn't say something. Presumably they were scared. If you're talking to them and they're still scared, then you're not going to get the information. So I think the first thing is to let them know about the confidentiality of the conversation and why this is important. Obviously, depending on where it goes, at some point, it will have to come out that the information is from them. But at least for this initial part, to just let them know that they can speak freely with you. They don't have anything to worry about, and find out what their fears are. Like maybe they suspected it before, or they had an unpleasant interaction with that physician before. Whatever the situation is, you want to get to the bottom of it. But if you don't address that, then you still might not get the full story. And if you're talking to the actual physician, then I think we go back to what we talked about earlier, where it's just good to have open-ended questions and to not jump out the gate, being accusatory. Heard you came to work and operated while you were drunk, but that's not the way to start. So, having open-ended questions and letting them give you the information, and even if it's in a story form, how was your day, and were you under any whatever, what was your day before, were you up all night, were you on call, whatever it is that lets them feel like you are on their side and trying to help them out. Or I know you weren't impaired, but in case the patient's attorney thinks that you were, we need to come up with defenses. So, let's talk this through. What are some of the things that they could perceive? I know that's not true, but what are some of the things that somebody could accuse you of doing? And that kind of approach might help you get more information from, in that case, the physician.
Good points. The third scenario I wanted to talk about briefly before we launch into some more pointed, specific questions was a scenario that actually happened to me. I was probably midway in my career, and I was at a large health system, and all of a sudden, one week, people started leaving secret stuff in my chair. I didn't know who was doing it. They didn't want to reveal who they were in the beginning. Then their spokesperson come forward, and, at first blush, I was wondering, is this just a bunch of disgruntled employees that are unhappy with their manager? Unfortunately, as I dug deeper into it, there was grave concern about a leader that, allegedly was, behaving in a way of, demonstrating, sexual harassment, theft from the organization, badgering employees, just a long multitude of things. And as I dug further, this particular manager, who had not been with the organization that particularly long, we had settled a case about 30 days prior to this investigative process on a claim of sexual harassment. So that was concerning. As I dug deeper and verified the complaints of the staff, initially they were saying, if you don't do anything, HR won't do anything. If you don't do anything, we are going to go file a lawsuit and we're going to go to the media. So you're our last hope. So what I ended up doing was, immediately I was thinking about protecting my interview notes and all that. So I aligned with our employment lawyer to protect the notes and collaborate with her as these interviews, happen for this group of people. So we were able to get to the bottom of it, and there was a termination that happened with that particular leader that was so destructive. So when these types of situations happen, the risk manager, it's sudden. It's not like they're coming and that sort of thing. So I think it's important for our audience today, whether it's this scenario or other scenarios that we talked about, the medication error or, drug abuse or diversion, what, our approach in going into trying to gather information to affirm what the complaint is about and whether those allegations have merit, or is it just, somebody that's disgruntled and unhappy in their role at the institution. So are there any particular strategies that you recommend other than what we've talked about in regards to anything with this scenario in particular?
I think something that jumped out at me, if I can start with this one, is, you mentioned that the employee said you were the last straw. So I think just on a more personal touch, when you're talking to them, starting off with an apology. I mean, it sounds like they had tried other methods and people weren't listening, or they couldn't get the attention, or they weren't being believed. And I think starting it off with, I am so sorry that it's come to this. Please let me know what's going on. Fill me in. Let's see what we can do to work through this. And just letting them know that you believe them. That's not a unique scenario. Unfortunately, there are times when the employees feel like they're not being heard, or people don't believe them. So hopefully starting off with just acknowledging that, addressing that elephant in the room, will, make them open up in that conversation. And then I've got more thoughts about it when you're talking to the actual person, but I don't know if you want me to wait on that, or Cody, if you want to talk about talking to the other witnesses first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and Leigh Ann, I believe you, I don't know if you said what role this leader was in, but, I think that could dictate too, what, is he oversells, or is he the lead attorney, right? And so depending upon his role in the organization as a leader may dictate which path you go down. And again, one of the things you're going to want to look at beyond, obviously you're trying to find a cause here, but, were there some flags of, how did this individual get hired in the first place? Were there some questions that weren't asked initially, or backgrounds that weren't done, or, what could we do to learn from this to keep this situation from happening again? So, but yes, as far as it sounds like, again, this one, kind of like the last scenario, is something that could really could give you some exposure. And so you really want to get together with your, internally and see, make sure you're crossing all your T's and dotting your I's, and then, interviewing individuals, again, based upon the information you gather up front as much as you can, and then formulating a plan of who we want to talk to, what order, and, kind of formulating that plan from there.
And the thing I was going to say is, if, again, depending on the leader, but it's in this scenario, that leader would need their own attorney, because presumably all of the employees are going to point the finger, and it would be a conflict of interest to have, everybody trying to representing people who are on opposite sides. So that's something that I would be cautious of right from the beginning. But, as the risk manager, I think it's important to jump right in and get answers to the questions as soon as possible. And in that situation, especially since you had just settled another lawsuit with similar allegations, I think involving legal is definitely the key thing to do right early on in that process.
Yeah. And you I think Melanie, you and Leigh Ann both said the word allegation, and that's what it is, right? And so I think, as you go in and you're doing these investigations and doing these interviews, you do have to keep that open mind that it is an allegation, and you don't know anything. And so as you're, keeping that in the the forefront of your mind as you're asking your questions, that, and because you just, you don't know the motivation, the motives of folks. And so you've got to make sure that's something you're aware of.
Right, right. Well, which leads me to the next topic I wanted to talk with you guys about is documentation, because when you're interviewing staff, there's various ways to document throughout, a hospital clinical setting, and not all of them are protected. And so do you have any particular recommendations from an investigative point of view or a legal point of view about the documentation, what should occur? Because if you're going to a deposition or whatever, the last thing that you want to hear is somebody has a secret file that you haven't seen, and it was under their desk hidden, and they have like 10 years of information in it. So, and that has happened before in some cases that I was involved in. So I would like to get your, opinions and expertise with regard to that particular question, because the documentation in every single case, it seems like we handle is either lacking. There was only one case in my entire career where documentation was stellar. So it's usually everyone's in a hurry, documentation is not so good, or you might, with the investigation process, you might have somebody, and maybe it's a risk manager, maybe it's somebody else that's very meticulous and they're nervous about being blamed for something. So they document like books of information and they keep it privately. So what do you say about that?
You combine like three things, Leigh Ann. So I think I think I'll address the last one. I think having all the detail from a lawyer's perspective is not possible to have too much detail. I think that is key, especially since there are things you think you'll remember 2 years down the road or later, you won't remember. So I love more detail. That said, I'm presuming that these notes are going to be kept confidential. Don't include them in the patient's chart. Don't mention them in the chart. Nobody should mention, I reported this to risk management or I met with risk, or, nothing like that. So that way the notes are protected, and hopefully the hospital has a separate system that is the repository for these kind of peer review situations where notes can be compiled and stored there. And that way you just do it as in the normal course of business. That's where you save those notes. And that way that's protected. The attorneys aren't, for the plaintiff, they're not even allowed to know that happened, much less know what your note said. So in the witness in a deposition should not say, I took 10 pages of notes when I interviewed. Like, hopefully they're prepared and know not to say that. But I wouldn't worry too much about taking too much detail. The only thing I guess is, since we're talking about interviewing, Leigh Ann, one thing that I run into is you can't really take that many notes while you're talking to the person, because some people clam up when they see you writing. And so it might be the situation where you need to just have the conversation, and then as soon as you're done, go and write down everything you can remember. I have had situations, if it's a highly technical conversation, like how does brain surgery work, where I ask the physician if I can record that part of the conversation. And I assure them it's just for my notes, just so I can remember what hemispheres of the brain we're talking about, or whatever the situation is. And they'll allow that. But, I think in general, it is probably hard to come up with 10 pages of notes while you're interviewing if you're writing the notes afterwards.
Right. And I think people get nervous when they think they're going to be recorded. Cody, what do you think?
So, well, to kind of add on what Melanie was saying, is going in as a risk manager doing an interviews, if you are going to take any notes, I would definitely get with legal and say, hey, this is, you're going to be taking notes, and then what are these notes going to be used for? And just to make sure, again, you are following legal protocols on that. So I personally will usually take notes. There are benefits when you are interviewing someone to have two individuals conducting that interview. Again, it may depend on that individual. They may not respond as well with two people. Sometimes they may respond better with two in there. One of the nice things about having two people is you can have one person asking the questions. You can have one person, identifying their responses, looking for any, nonverbal and verbal alignment, those types of things, and taking notes. But if for me, when I interview, if I interview alone, I usually will take notes, and I tell them ahead of time, I am going to be taking notes. I give them a heads up and just say, hey, I may jot down a quick note. So I present it to them up front to let them know what I'm doing, but my notes are not detailed. A lot of times I'll take notes when I'm asking them an open-ended question. They're telling me a story. I don't want to interrupt them. They may say something about Friday. So I'll just write down the word Friday. So when they get done talking, I can quickly look down and say, oh yeah, I wanted to go back. You said this happened on Friday. So it helps me to kind of, just remember. And then too, I can show, oh, look, it's just Friday was all I was asking you about. So I think if you're up front a lot of times with folks and you let them know and you're not writing a book out, there can be some benefit to that. But again, every situation is different. So,
and if they know, Cody, that the notes are protected or it's just for your recollection and it will be safeguarded, that might also help. But I think, remember earlier we were talking about flexibility. This is another one of those situations where you observe if the witness stops talking when you start writing, then,
Right. Yeah. And for the audience, I just want to make sure that, I talk about this, there's different ways to record the information. We have the Patient Safety Organization, which is a repository that provides more protection on some of our investigations. And sometimes you hire a lawyer and you want to put attorney-client work product at the top or bottom of the document, or it just might be risk management is investigating. So the risk manager needs to make sure that they know going in what method and that they have thought about protection of your work product before you start putting pen to paper or have a recorder, that sort of thing. So that'll help them be more prepared. And because, it's all about enterprise risk management and heading off those risks. And you certainly don't want to create more risks. And, sometimes plaintiff attorneys do ask for the risk management's, information and folder. So that, you have to, be mindful of that. And I've only had that happen once in my career so far. So, and we fought it tooth and nail and they didn't get it, but, just be mindful of what you document because you don't want to create more risk and more exposure for the enterprise. And so I was looking at my notes and I wanted, we talked about the interview witness, process, the questions, open-ended questions, and those might be, tell me more about, and things that aren't a yes or no answer, correct? Do you have any particular favorite open-ended question that you feel always gets you information?
Well, an open-ended question is obviously going to get you more information than a closed-ended with a yes or no, right?
Right.
So a lot of times you're going to want those, what I like to do is start with those open-ended questions to just let them tell me their story. There may be situations where I just listen and let them go on and on and on. I may ask a close-ended to get them back in line. But there may be situations where you don't let them go on and on. I think a hard time for a hard thing for a lot of interviewers is to just listen, right? And that's because we have a lot of questions, we want answers. But if one of the best things you can do is just ask a question and sit there and listen. Initial questions a lot of times that I'm going to ask are to establish a baseline, to see how they respond and how they react to certain questions, to how they recall a memory. So when I ask questions down the line, are they recalling it the same way or are they recalling it a different way? So again, it's going to be unique that depending upon the information you want, one interview you may ask questions at the beginning and another interview you may ask those same questions at the end. And it just really kind of depends on the information you're trying to gather in that individual. But yes, a lot of times those open-ended are definitely going to be the questions that are used to get a lot of your information, where that individual is going to be able to kind of give you a story, tell you what's going on with it, and help you formulate other questions off that response.
And I'll ask them if they have any questions for me, especially if somebody is super nervous or guarded. I'll say, do you have any questions for me? And I'll say, are you nervous or are you worried? Let's talk about that. And then they might go into it and explain why they are nervous or what they're worried about, or whatever information will make them feel more comfortable in the conversation. But yeah, I don't know that I have favorite open-ended questions. Just like Cody said, whatever I can ask that gets them talking. What happened and what do you remember? Has this happened before? I mean, those kind of questions I think are the basics that you start with. But other than that, it's going to be pretty tailored to the situation, like Cody said.
Yeah, and I'm glad Cody brought up the issue of listening, because I think most of us aren't trained to listen well. And, you're sitting there thinking, and you might be thinking about your next question that you want to ask, and you're thinking, where this is going to go. And if we don't listen well, we're not going to capture what we could capture if we did. And, I had one scenario where a high profile surgeon came in my office. He was in a case that was in, it was an event. The lawsuit was not filed yet. And it was the last day that the statute of limitations was supposed to expire. And the plaintiff attorney filed that particular day. He came in so distraught, broke down in tears. And at first I thought he was laughing, but then I quickly realized he was very distraught. And this was way before there was any programs in place with, other physicians, like a support group and that sort of things when events occur. And, I sat there for a good long time and just listened. And the root of what he was upset about was he was afraid of the lawsuit that they were going to take all his assets, that his daughter wouldn't be able to finish college. And, it's just, the list just went on. He was terrified. So I think, no matter what role you're serving, whether it's the risk manager, the attorney, the investigator, the listening component is huge. And like Melanie, you mentioned before, when people don't feel heard, they're just going to shut down. Like if they don't think that you're hearing them, or Cody, as you pointed out, body language. If I'm looking at my watch and I'm in an RCA and I only have an hour and all I can think about is I just need it to be shut down because I have another meeting. Those are the things that risk managers deal with all the time. And I think the body language is important. If somebody feels like you're bored and they're yawning and they're looking around the room or tapping, those things I think can sabotage an investigative process. And the information that you receive, I feel quite confident will be more limited than it would be if, you weren't, in such a hurry and you were more mindful. So I think the communication piece, and like I said before, it's all about connection, and we're in the people business. And if we don't communicate well and we don't establish that trust and connection in the beginning, it's going to be harder in the end to make that happen. So Dan, I wanted to ask you, from your lens, you know, you deal with a lot of healthcare clients across the US. Do you have requests from any of those folks or interest or inquiries about documentation of their investigative notes, or do they want you to create a platform to house that?
For average customer, I guess, if not 1,000, may have as many as 100 different documents in the software that isn't specific to an event, right? And then for each event, they'll have documents, and in particularly if it became PCE, there's a whole module dedicated just to that. You know, that causes me to ask this question. As in your investigative role, do you find yourselves in your technique specifically being supportive of just culture?
Well, from my perspective, the risk management lens, I think the just culture has been a huge shift and an improvement, you know, because you follow the algorithm and you kind of take away, because let's face it, some people are in roles that they shouldn't be in and don't have any people training skills. And I think the just culture algorithm has kind of taken that piece out and kind of created like a flow map for one to follow should you have to, you know, interview somebody, ask questions. So I think it's been a positive movement. And for the risk managers, I don't think it hamstrings us. I think it helps us. That way you can ensure that there was fair and due process throughout the interview or the investigation. Because oftentimes it wasn't like that at all. It might even feel punitive. And that was a problem. What about you guys, Cody, Melanie? Do you have anything to add on that?
I think just echoing what you said. I mean, anything that gets people to feel like the process is fair, I think that's an improvement. So, I mean, I think I always say we can defend anything as long as it's the truth, right? We just can't defend lies. So if people feel like it's a fair process and that it's, and including the risk managers, from the risk managers to the witnesses, if everyone feels like it's a fair process, then as a lawyer, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, it's just got to be consistent across the board. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that consistency is key. So I think that just culture helps with that too. I think one of the main hesitations that risk managers have with regards to, Dan, what you mentioned, you know, housing the information in a software platform is the legal protection and what that would look like or what would be afforded. Because, you know, oftentimes if you have many different technology pieces and for instance, you're going through discovery and you have to print out the records and stuff. It seems like always there's something that gets printed that shouldn't be in there, you know, and making sure that whatever pathways and storage buckets there are, that they are secure and have secure parameters where the likelihood of that happening becomes less and less as technology is advancing. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if you've had any of your clients come forward and say, look, can you put this in there? Or perhaps you've met with their legal counsel in whatever particular state that might have a request and a mandate, you know, for the protection and for that argument.
Yeah, I'm surprised at some of the things they put in our repository. You would think that maybe they're just putting them there because it's more convenient. But maybe, as you say, maybe just having the fewer places to put things reduces the risk that something important isn't going to end up exposed.
Right.
Yeah.
I think they're key points.
Oh, could I ask an investigative question?
Sure.
Maybe.
So in your investigations, I'm sure there's a line of questioning that happens sometimes as to why the people at a particular facility failed to act on a patient safety event. Can you share some questions that you typically ask in that kind of a scenario?
So the scenario is if the medical team or the staff failed to act in a way that would have protected the patient from some harm.
Yeah, and or reported that to the risk manager.
You know, I would kind of would go back to I think it was mentioned earlier, but as you're looking at these incidents and the cause, you also want to look at why this happened and what can we keep this from happening again. And so, was there not any policies in place? Was there not training? Was the training not adequate? So you want to look at, and not to cut you off there, Melanie, but just for me, I think you want to really look where were we not proactive in this, and what can we change for next time to keep this from happening again?
And from the legal perspective, that helps the hospital's defense, right? Because in addition to protecting the specific treaters, we also want to protect the hospital. So the hospital's not on the hook for saying the hospital should have had this policy or this training or was negligent in their hiring. And if it's something we can avoid because maybe it's a scenario they never encountered before. I mean, that happens, right? Science is evolving. Every patient is different. And Dan, as a defense attorney, my underlying assumption is that the team did what they thought was best for the patient at the time with the information that they had. So I kind of initially reject that they didn't do something that would have protected the patient. And I go in with that assumption, I know you were doing all that you could for this patient. So let's talk about that. And if it's something maybe that they hadn't encountered, they hadn't been trained on, or some unique scenario or they'd never seen that before, that is a time where I let them educate me and let them know, I'm here, I'm all ears. Tell me train me, fill me in, let me imagine what it was like to be there on that hall or in that patient's room, and tell me what happened. So I think just letting them know, I start off with the assumption that, I'm sure that they were doing all that they could with the limited information they had at that time. Obviously, in retrospect, they can say, oh, if I had known that, we would have done X, Y, and Z. But from the legal perspective, you don't have to, you can't be held to a standard of retrospect. You can't be expected to have information that was only gained later on. Sorry, that was such a long answer, but.
No.
And I would agree. Most of the times I don't see like malintent where somebody is intending not to do something to the patient. However, a lot of things that occur is maybe a doctor comes into the OR with coffee in a sterile environment and he repeatedly violates, policy of not having food or drink in there. That scenario, or flies in the OR, somebody opened the back door because it was hot and the air conditioner wasn't working well, and they knew that there was a problem with flies and they did it anyway. But there's that mentality versus the mentality, I'm doing this and I know it's going to harm the patient. So either way, I think, in the scenarios I've dealt with, having to have those pointed discussions with either the physician or staff members. This is do you know what the policy is regarding, scope of practice, and kind of going over that, because a lot of times, staff there might be too many policies, or they don't know where to find it, or things have changed, technology changed, and they don't know how to get in to look at it, or if something was updated. But oftentimes, though, with coffee and food in the OR, there's some organizations that I've practiced at that, you have your repeated offenders and, they're just like, it doesn't matter, and then they get in trouble and then they do it again in 6 months. So it's a work in progress.
Food and flies, Leigh Ann, what a combo.
Yeah, I know. I was like, I've had both of those happen. I was like, it's, the fly thing was a nightmare because we couldn't, figure out, but then somebody was opening the door and, and that poses potential infection to those that are in surgery and that sort of thing. So it was a big deal. And so we had to secure those rooms, shut them down, figure out where the point of entry was. But, risk managers, have those types of things happen, all the time. And, it's just the nature of the beast. So I think with what we've talked about today to help risk managers, with lines of questioning and to think about some things, as they, grow in their practice and grow their skill set, it's super important to really hone in on, sentence structure, investigative techniques, and knowing what your options are. With that being said, are there any key takeaways that you would for sure out of this whole discussion that you want risk managers or healthcare individuals that are in leadership positions that you would want them to walk away to know this is, what you need to have gotten out of what I said?
I think, Leigh Ann, so in regards to doing the interviewing, I mean, it's like most things, it takes practice. And the more you do, the better you're going to get at it. You're going to learn, how to formulate your questions better, how to interpret the responses and the reactions. For individuals who haven't had any training or haven't had experience, I'd highly recommend they go through some type of interview training. And, again, unfortunately, there's no situation where there's always going to be one right answer. You may have one experienced interviewer do it one way and another one do it a different way, and they may come to the same conclusion, just take a different path to get there. But I think, again, at the end of the day, it's you've got to really do your due diligence up front, ask lots of questions, and just seek training and to do everything you can, put all the cards in your favor to help you try to not only learn what was the cause of this, but what can we do to keep this from happening again?
And keep the method of communication open, so if you have the conversation or if you are new to interviewing and, this is just an initial conversation, I'm trying to get information, I still have to talk to other people I might come back to with more questions, just prepare them for that. And it kind of might take the pressure off you as the interviewer to feel like you've got to ask them everything you can possibly ask in this one shot. You can just, open the door, leave it open for another conversation later on. And this might be a good situation if it is tricky, you might want to have an initial meeting. Like if you're the risk manager and you need to talk to a nurse and you haven't met them before, drop by the floor, introduce yourself, and hey, I'm going to talk to you about this case or claim. I'll catch you. But that way, before they hear from you for the first time to set up the interview, they already have kind of a relationship. Granted, it might be short, but at least you have introduced yourself, and then you can have a conversation in a more private setting later on. But I think that just goes to opening that door, I think, will help you as especially for those who are, like Cody said, new to interviewing.
There may be situations, just like Melanie was saying. I mean, if someone thinks it's a formal interview versus you may need a few pieces of information, you may be able to get casually from someone in a break room when no one else is around, that you couldn't get in that formal interview situation. So there may be times where you want to have them sit down with you face to face in an office. There may be other times where it's, you catch them out having coffee. Again, it's going to be case by case, but some situations could, get you a different, answer than another.
Right. I think you guys are both on point. I think integrity in the interview investigative process is key because keep in mind these